Toussaint L'Ouverture died in a French prison cell high in the mountains, and he wasn't captured in battle to get there. He was invited to dinner. 7 months after he died, a French general named Rochambeau gave up and pulled his army off the island. CLR James calls what happened there the only successful slave revolt in history. And here's the thing about the invitation that ended the man at the center of it. Another letter came first. On the 6th of June, 1802, the French commander in Saint-Domingue sat down and wrote to Paris. Leclerc wrote, quote, "I have drawn from his submission the object I had expected, which was to detach from him Dessalines and Christophe with their troops. I am going to order his arrest." End quote. That's the 6th. The friendly invitation to Toussaint, the one James says was full of promises of good faith, went out on the 7th. I keep coming back to that gap. One day, a man writes down what he's about to do and then writes the warm letter that does it. This isn't only a fact about 1802. It changes the order the story comes in. I'd been carrying it as revolution, then freedom, then failure. The arrest order goes in front of all three.
There's an explanation for Haiti that can feel like enough. You can watch it work every time the country shows up in print as a failed state. So, who set the price of Haiti's freedom? And what happens to the story when you put that price back into it? 4 steps. The letter and the arrest. The cell, where a prison official writes one sentence I still can't get out of my head. The war fought after the man was gone. And a bill. Hold one date for me. 1947. James opens the chapter with a decision so blunt, it almost reads as a joke. Bonaparte asked which system had made the colonies richest. He was told the old one. He decided to bring it back. One point of precision, because this is where most accounts go wrong. Did Napoleon restore slavery in Saint-Domingue? He meant to. He restored it in Guadeloupe that July, and in Cayenne in December. And the famous law of May 1802 didn't cover Saint-Domingue at all. It was never put back there by law, because the French lost first. That's the measure of the whole thing. The force sent to do it was, by James's count, the biggest France had ever put to sea. 20,000 veterans, Bonaparte's own brother-in-law in charge, and Leclerc's wife bringing musicians and artists and a whole court with her. James sums up the mood dryly. Put slavery back, call it civilization returning, and have a good time doing it. Of the 60,000 France sent in the end, he says almost none came home. Then they took the man by a trick. Toussaint had been warned. He wasn't well. He went anyway, with 2 officers at 8 that evening. They talked a short while. His host stepped out of the room, and soldiers with fixed bayonets came through the door. No flag of truce, no battle, a dinner invitation. So why did he go? The instinct is to call him naive. James won't take that. Staying away meant running, and running meant starting the war again from far worse ground than the deal he'd already made, with his 2 best generals, by Leclerc's own boast, already pulled away from him. James lays out the choices and leaves the motive open. What we do know is what he said stepping onto the ship to the captain. James reads the line as something he'd worked out beforehand and meant as a parting instruction to his people. Toussaint said, quote, "In overthrowing me, you have cut down in Saint-Domingo only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again by the roots, for they are numerous and deep." End quote. Take that as an argument rather than a prophecy, and it gets sharper. He's telling them they've misread what they're fighting. They think the revolution is a man. That's why they came for a man. He's telling them it's a root system. So, the first piece. Somebody chose this and dated it, which leaves one thing oddly thin in a plan that careful.
Leclerc wrote that he had plenty on Toussaint from before the pardon he'd given him, and nothing at all from after. So what do you do with a prisoner when the only thing you can prove against him is something you already pardoned? You don't put him on trial. Leclerc had written that trying and executing him would only enrage the black population. So the problem became a paperwork problem. He landed at Brest in July, saw his family for the last time, and on the 24th of August, they locked him in a fortress in the Joux Mountains, more than 3,000 feet up. James thinks Bonaparte chose to kill him slowly, with cold and hunger and bad treatment. There's a fair objection. What James shows you is instructions and a pattern, not a death warrant. And a sick prisoner dying in a cold cell needs no plot to explain it. Fine. Take only what he documents. On Bonaparte's strict orders, the jailers put him in convict's clothes, cut his food, took away his servant, and reduced his firewood when winter reached a cell where, James says, the walls ran with damp. Bonaparte sent an aide to find his hidden fortune. 7 interviews turned up nothing because there was nothing to find. And then they stopped his medical care. In writing, with the reason given. This is the jailer's own official report. He wrote, quote, "The construction of Negroes being totally different to that of Europeans, I have dispensed with his doctor and his surgeon, who would be useless to him." End quote. Read that again. There's no threat in it, no anger. It reads like a man filling out a form. And the thing he assumes, so obvious to him he doesn't argue it, is that this prisoner's body is different enough that medicine would be wasted on it. Which is why the argument about intent doesn't save anyone. The firewood was somebody's decision. So was the doctor. He wrote long letters to Bonaparte asking for a trial. No trial came. James says that mind, which had never seemed to need rest, kept sliding into long stretches of unconsciousness. One April morning, they found him dead in his chair. The 7th of April, 1803. James ends that scene by setting 2 things side by side, and I want to be exact because the move is doing real work. He writes that as Toussaint lay dying, his own officers, with no idea what was happening to him, were putting independence on paper. Strictly, the formal declaration came at the end of that year, so James is compressing, and I'd rather say so than let it slide. His point survives anyway. Just under 6 weeks after he died in that cell, his officers took the white out of the French flag and wrote liberty or death across what was left. He never knew. Take the man away, and the thing stays. So if the leader is dead, what are the French now trying to do to a country they can't hold? James answers out of their own mail. Leclerc's letters, he says, show a man who had settled on a war of extermination, and James spells out what that meant: killing as many black people as they could. Rochambeau carried it out. So James traces the race war to French policy rather than Haitian revenge, using the letters of the men running the campaign. Rochambeau brought in 1,500 dogs to hunt people and staged the first demonstration in an arena with a band playing. He drowned so many in the bay at Le Cap that James says people there stopped eating fish. An officer named Kai Vaisseau wrote to a colleague that November that what they were doing had stopped being a war and turned into something between animals, and that he kept having to tell his own men he didn't want their courage anymore. He wanted their fury. Now the other side of it. Yellow fever killed more of that army than anything else did. Of roughly 31,000 who landed, 7,000 or 8,000 survived, and Leclerc's letters say it plainly: all my army is destroyed. So the honest version isn't that Haitian fighters beat Napoleon on their own. It also isn't that the fever did it and the Haitians barely mattered. Mosquitoes take no ground. The scholars who've actually measured this treat the disease and the fighting as decisive together, and I'll take that over either clean story.
And here's what that population did, recorded by the men losing to them. James is blunt about who won. Not Dessalines' army, and not his cruelty, he says, but the people, who burned the colony down to a wasteland rather than leave it standing for anyone else. One prisoner, unnamed, defended it by saying, what they'd grown was theirs to destroy, because a man's own labor is his to dispose of. That's one man speaking. Elsewhere in the chapter, 3 people were sentenced to be burned alive. A boy of 19, tied so he couldn't see the other 2, called out to them that they didn't know how to die, and then showed them. More than 40 years later, a memoirist who'd been there and who believed in slavery wrote that the sight was still as vivid to him as the moment he saw it. He describes a column, torn apart by cannon fire, advancing without one step backward. And he says they came on singing, 2,000 voices, with the guns underneath like a bass line. Then this. Lemonnier Delafosse wrote, quote, "But what men these blacks are, how they fight, and how they die," end quote. If you'd rather not take the word of the people who won, take the records of the people who lost. At the last assault on Le Cap in November 1803, James describes shouting from every side, a roll of drums, and the French holding fire while a rider carried Rochambeau's compliments to Capua, the officer leading the charge. That night, Rochambeau decided to evacuate. On the last day of December, the declaration was read out, and the new country took a new name, Haiti. So the war to wipe them out failed. What comes next is the massacre of the French who stayed. And James does something genuinely surprising with it. Between February and April 1804, in the months after independence, Dessalines ordered the killing of the French still living there. Somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 people died, with documented exceptions: Poles, Germans, priests, medical staff, some women. And it's true. It happened. James reports something about it that rarely travels with the story. At the Congress that declared independence, 3 Englishmen were in the room, one of them an agent named Cathcart. James writes that they gave their word England would trade with the new country and protect its independence, but only once every white person left in it was dead. He calls it the most shameful thing in the entire story. Let me slow down, because he rested on a single source from 1898 with nothing behind it, and then adds that the Americans were probably in on it too, while admitting he has no evidence. So hold it as his claim, thinly sourced. Strike that source out completely, and the 2 pillars with their own separate evidence are untouched. The War of Extermination, which James reads out of Leclerc's own letters, and the bill, which sits in a French royal decree. That allegation is the one brick here I can't vouch for. The wall stands without it. And here's where I have to turn on the reading this episode has been building toward. Once you've heard about that room, there's an easy move available. File the massacre under things done to Haiti. Put the killing in the world's column, and Haitians come out of the story clean. James blocks it. He hands you the excuse and then refuses to let you spend it. James wrote, quote, "It was not policy, but revenge, and revenge has no place in politics," end quote. He calls it a tragedy, then says whose? Not the whites. He won't spend a tear or a drop of ink on those old slave owners. The tragedy belonged to the black and mixed race population because killing like that coarsens the people who do it, and this was a people only just becoming a nation. Elsewhere, he calls Dessalines a barbarian, his word, which is harder than it looks, because the moment here that feels most like justice is the one James says damaged them most. Take him seriously, and you don't get to keep the receipt and the innocence both.
You have to hold a people wronged on the scale this book documents, who then did something that hurt them, and hold both without letting either cancel the other.
So here's the answer, and I'll keep it as uncertain as the evidence is. Haiti was charged for its freedom 3 times over by different hands and on very different evidence. First, as a war whose stated aim, in Leclerc's own letters, was to kill as many black people as possible. Then, if that 1898 source holds, as a price attached to English trade and protection. And then, on paper anyone can read, as a bill. James saw the first two. He describes the isolation, the wrecked economy, white people barred from Haiti for generations, and then writes the sentence that opens the door onto everything after him. He wrote, quote, "that the new nation survived at all is forever to its credit. For if the Haitians thought that imperialism was finished with them, they were mistaken." End quote. These chapters don't take you past that, so let the record finish the sentence. April 1825. 14 French warships appear off the coast, and the king issues a decree. Haiti will be recognized as independent in exchange for 150 million francs, paid to the people who used to own its population. To make the first payment, Haiti had to borrow from French banks. The money to buy recognition came from the banks of the country demanding it, which is why historians call it the double debt. A treaty in 1838 cut the total to 90 million. An analysis commissioned by the New York Times in 2022 put what Haiti handed over at the equivalent of roughly $560 million, and the growth it never got at $21 billion at the low end. In 2025, the French president acknowledged the debt and set up a joint commission of historians while stopping short of promising reparations. The original debt was cleared in the 1880s, but the loans that grew out of it weren't paid off until 1947, and the last payment went to a bank in New York. That's the date I asked you to hold. Someone might say back that plenty of new countries start out hated and get over it. But look at what this money was for. It went to the former owners, to compensate them for losing the people who were now the nation. And of those 3 charges, the bill is the one that travels easiest because it's the only one that turned into something somebody had to keep paying. The other 2 were events. A debt is a relationship. It has a balance and it sends statements. And the book that makes that case won't let it settle anything. 2 true things that don't resolve into one. If James is right that the isolation and the wrecked economy are the engine, then much of what followed is a story of charges from outside, and the failure story stops being enough on its own. But if the massacre and the emperor crowned later that same year, and what came after, a man James flatly calls a barbarian, and then a successor doing what James calls a cruel best, were real choices, then the outside account is incomplete no matter how damning the receipts are. I think the break is there. James puts that massacre a year late, incidentally after the coronation. The record puts it months before. It doesn't touch his argument. It does mean you check him. That's not a weakness in the book. It's the whole reason to read one. Go back to the trunk and the roots. He said it stepping onto the ship that began the journey to that cell. Read the man who built it and didn't live to see it. Then look at what it cost to prove him right.